Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with the wonderful and lovely Wendy Pearlman. Wendy is the Crown Professor of Middle East Studies and Interim Director of Middle East and North Africa Studies Program at Northwestern University. Many of her main interests are in comparative politics of the Middle East. She has a Bachelor's from Brown University and a PhD from Harvard. She is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, The Home I Worked to Make, Voices from the New Syrian Diaspora. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We talk about how there's different ways you can tell these stories, Syrian stories. And we talk about how she constructed a book with these kind of, stories from folks around the world that have left Syria because of the conflict there. We talk about protests around the world, the ongoing Syrian conflict, the concept of home and internal displacement. We talk about what it's like for some of these folks to leave Syria and rebuild elsewhere. We talk about how they maintain their culture and adapt to sometimes new cultures, the future of the Syrian diaspora, and many other topics. As we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, this is unfortunately a conflict that hasn't gone away, and there's still daily killings in Syria, some horrific things that are still going on. And while the world continues to move and there are conflicts elsewhere in the world, this is still something that's been going on for almost a decade and a half, unfortunately, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. And so it's important to still take interest, to be supportive. And one of the things that she does in her book, which is great, is to let people from Syria that have been displaced around the world tell their story in their own words. And so I think that's it's a very powerful thing. It's really, really important. It's really, really needed. And she was just excellent at having the conversation and all of the work that she's doing. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, all the wonderful things. It's much appreciated. And now I bring you Wendy Pearlman. I am here with Wendy Pearlman. Wendy, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. You have written a wonderful book, a much needed book that I really, really enjoyed reading and really thinking about the themes in the book. That book is called The Home I Worked to Make, Voices from the New Syrian Diaspora. This is, if I remember correctly, this is a kind of sequel, or there was a book you had before this, or is this part of a trilogy? Tell me about that.
Well, it's a follow-up to another book, so there's not a trilogy yet.
No, yeah, okay.
The idea, maybe there'll be three, but this is the second. I published a book in 2017 called We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. And that was a similar style, another collection of testimonials or a curation of excerpts of interviews that I did with displaced Syrians. And when I wrote that book in 2017, I never imagined that it would be one of a series.
Mm-hmm.
It was a book that I started to write and wrote, and based on interviews that I had been doing with Syrian refugees for many years. And after that book was published, I just kept doing it. I kept doing more and more interviews with displaced Syrians. The stories continued, and I felt that that first book didn't say all there was to say on the topic, so this became the second book. But they go together in an interesting way.
Yeah. That's very, very nice. So before we get into a lot of the themes of the book, why don't you just tell listeners kind of your snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, how you've come to work with refugees and specifically Syrian refugees. Just kind of give us the quick peek into who you are.
Yeah, so I am a professor of political science at Northwestern University. So I have my degree in political science with a focus on the Middle East. I began studying the Middle East in the mid-1990s during a college semester abroad and got hooked, and I've been doing it ever since. I've written 3 books related to Palestinian politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in 2011, I was captivated by the Arab Spring, like so many people in my field and people really across the world. And at that point, I began studying Syria as one example of the Arab Spring, and started doing interviews with Syrian refugees in 2012 as a way of gathering Syrian stories about protest and uprising and the Arab uprisings as they unfolded in Syria. It was too dangerous to go inside Syria at the time and do interviews inside Syria.
Mm.
So I began talking to Syrians who fled the country as refugees.
Mm.
And I wasn't particularly interested in them as refugees. I wasn't interested in the refugee experience and the experience of displacement.
Mm-hmm.
I was really talking to them about protest and their lives inside Syria, but was accessing them outside the country. That was in 2012. And I just kept doing it.
Mm.
And I began in the summer in Jordan, interviewing Syrians there. I went back to Jordan. I went on to Turkey. I went on to Lebanon, eventually started going to Europe. Eventually started doing interviews over Zoom. And after about 12, 13 years of interviewing Syrian refugees, I have somehow done interviews with over 500 people,
Wow.
really around the world,
Wow.
across 5 continents.
Wow.
And now have written my second book based on those interviews.
Mm. What was, I guess, the motivation? Was it to, with this conflict that's been going on for far too long, 13 years? Was it to kind of let many people around the world, or a Western audience, let's say, kind of get a glimpse into the lives of many people and what they're going through? Or was it to give them a voice, and, so that way you can kind of be a conduit, so that way people can hear their voice, and maybe a lot of people aren't able to get their voice out there? I guess, what was the motivation for giving these kind of snapshots, or these pictures of various people, as you do in the book?
Yeah, so there were there are many different sort of motivations and phases of this long project. And I think of it as a 10-year plus project, of which this new book is the latest iteration and the latest product. When I began in 2012, it really began actually as a more academic project. And I was really interested in the question of what motivates people to participate in high risk dissent, which is a kind of academic way of saying, like, how did people muster the courage to go out and risk their lives in protest in a tremendously brutal authoritarian regime? And I thought that if I wanted to understand that human experience of deciding to participate in protest with such enormous risk, there was no better way than to simply ask people who had participated in protest why they did it and what it felt like and how it changed them, and everything related to it. So I began with that open-ended question, doing interviews with people about their experience of the uprising, the Syrian Revolution. That was the very beginning, and then with time, I found that open-ended interviews, we just gave people some space to talk about their lives, and for me as a political scientist, especially about their experiences of politics, opened a door to the most fascinating sort of stories, reflections. People were not only telling me their experiences of authoritarianism, of protest, of war, of displacement, but they were also analyzing it, reflecting upon it, making sense of these epic sorts of tumult. So I just kept doing it. And over the years, so the first book that I published in 2017, We Crossed a Bridge, is something of an oral history of the Syrian uprising. It aims to tell, through these personal testimonials, how the Syrian uprising began, how it militarized, how it became a war, what the Syrian conflict is all about. And along the way, I published other very sort of academic articles. But although I said, when I began, I wasn't so interested in people's refugee displacement experience. I was more interested in their stories inside Syria. As I did these interviews year after year after year, I saw that the refugee dimension of their lives became more and more salient. In the beginning, most people I talked to didn't even identify as refugees. They literally crossed the border seeking temporary safety from bombardment and planned to go back any day. Any day they were going to go back. And then years went by and years went by, and many came to believe or realize that they would probably not go back. And the realization that they were refugees, and perhaps permanently so, and the need to create some sort of stability, find work, learn new languages, figure out solutions for their children, entered them into a different type of phase. And I felt so privileged along the way by doing interviews with so many different people over so many years. I got to capture the lived experience and lived reflections of people going through these different phases. So whereas the first book ends with people's stories of leaving Syria, I got to see that the story was in no way over then. So this new book starts with stories of people leaving Syria and then tries to trace what happens to them
Mm.
afterwards.
Mm. There's two questions here. I guess we could just see them as a kind of two long footnotes. So we don't have to get too sidetracked by this, but it's popping up in my mind. So I just want to ask you this. One question here is, I think for a lot of people in the West, particularly, I'm using that, kind of air quotes, but it's particularly in the United States, people in the United States have an idea of what protest is here, like how we protest in the United States. There's a certain there's a tenor to it. There's a rhythm to it. And I feel like definitely within the Arab Spring, and definitely in other parts of the world, even still currently, protests look and seem to feel a bit different. And there's usually a lot of very heavy weight attached to it. What do you want to say? I mean, the reason I'm asking is what do you want to say to maybe people that are not in Syria or people that are living in the U.S. and they say, yeah, I did a protest in 2020 or 2016, and there's some kind of analogous things there, or we can kind of and I guess just I'm not trying to look at differences per se, but definitely underscore. Yeah, kind of some of the unique features of how some of the protests in Syria have been and still are, and even in other places like in Iran or other parts of the world or the region.
Yeah, I mean, as flawed as the United States' democracy is in many ways, I think it can be difficult for many U.S. citizens to imagine what it is like to live in a genuine dictatorship, where if you go out and protest, you can be killed, uh, where there are armed police or the army stationed and are ready to shoot, to kill if you are protesting. You could be shot, you could be injured, you could be arrested, thrown into prison, never even receive a charge or a trial, be tortured, and rot in a dungeon prison with minimal food and overcrowded cells for the rest of your life. And your family outside might not even know if you're alive or dead. That is the reality. That is what people were risking when they went out to protest in Syria. They could be killed on the spot. And as many Syrians would say to me, you wish you would be killed rather than be imprisoned, which is a slow suffering death rather than a quick one. The risks were absolutely enormous. So for people to say that they were willing to take that risk because they wanted better politics, because they wanted a government that respected them as citizens, because they wanted basic rights, because they wanted to be able to speak their minds, because they wanted to be able to vote for their own leaders and hold them accountable, as opposed to live under a regime in which a man named Hafiz al-Assad seized power in a military coup in 1970 and then bequeathed the regime to his son when he died in the year 2000, lived under a single family for 50 years, where there's no rule of law to protect citizens, where there's rampant corruption. I mean, I could go on and on about the abuses and indignities and lack of opportunity and lack of protections. So I can't, even though I've talked now to hundreds of Syrians and literally asked this question, how did you gather the courage to go out and call for change, risking your own life? I still to this day can't imagine what it feels like. I can't imagine the thought process and can't imagine the emotions and can't imagine the sheer courage that it takes to be politically involved there. So for many of us Americans, and I often consider myself a woman, that sometimes take all these liberties for granted, that take the right to vote for granted so that we can't even be bothered to show up and vote,
Yeah.
that take for granted that we can call our congressional representatives or our senators and speak our minds, and that we have the right to, write in the newspaper and go out in demonstrations or voice our opinions in myriad ways.
Hmm.
Um, it's very easy to take those rights for granted and not even use them. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from people and places who would do anything to have those rights
Hmm.
and literally gave their lives for those rights. Um, their stories are tremendously inspiring, tremendously humbling, and I hope can give people in more democratic systems great appreciation for what they have.
Hmm. Yeah.
And also remember who along the way fought for it too,
Hmm.
so that we could take these rights for granted.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think nobody that lives in the U.S. Really gets it. Even people that have interacted with folks from these regions. So it's a good reminder for the things we do have in the U.S. and to just have a wide stance and kind of really open ears, open hearts to people that have gone through that. The second kind of footnote here, and I know this could really steer us
Right.
off, but
Backdrop to this book, but it's important too because it's kind of the story, the legacy that many of these folks that I've interviewed carry with them,
sure, yeah.
and then this book carries through with their new
Hmm.
lives.
Hmm.
Try to make it everywhere, but this is kind of the
Hmm.
political what they carry,
Yeah.
what they carry with them.
Yeah. But I'll get to the first major theme I want to stick to. But before that, I guess is this book is just coming out, and in a lot of ways, when I talk to people that I know and friends that I know that are Syrian, they'll say, "Look, people have forgotten about Syria. People, it's not in the news every day. It's not, we've gotten used to, uh, you know." Crimes against humanity, mass killings, women and children, suffering and dying, horrible things that happen every single day in Syria and have been happening for 13 years on an ongoing basis. And I guess just my brief question here is you know. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on in the world, and one of them is the conflict with Israel and Palestine, and that is very much oversaturating the news for a whole variety of reasons. Um, and so I guess, obviously there's, each conflict is different, and each, conflict will have its kind of moment in a news cycle. But I guess, with that kind of really taking a lot of the oxygen, and maybe some of that is justified, I guess, on a global stage. Um, but how do we not forget still that there is if you want to call it a civil war, if you want to call it an internal conflict, if you want to call it whatever you want to call it, is going on in Syria and still keeps going on, almost to the point where we are, in some ways, you see things with various organizations and groups, inviting Assad, to come to summits and to meetings and almost normalizing, like, oh yeah, we don't think about that as much anymore like we used to in 2013 or 2015. How do we, there's a lot of things going on. How do you want your book, I guess, to be received now, with so many things going on, to say, hey, we still need to remember not only the conflict in Syria, but also, displaced Syrians or Syrian diaspora around the world, especially in neighboring countries. Why is that still important? How do we still keep our kind of attention to that as well?
Oh, it's such a great question. And I mean, there are so many places of enormous violence and suffering in the world now. Sudan, Congo. I mean, as somebody who studied Palestine, lived in the West Bank and in Gaza for different stints over the years. I mean, 98% of my attention is in Gaza as well. So maybe you're asking the wrong person. I have to remind myself, oh, right, Syria. I wrote a book about Syria. I also do Syria. It's part of my job and my love and in my hearts as well. I mean, the situation in Gaza now is so tremendously urgent. The violence is so horrific. I mean, not just the bombardment and the forced displacement, but the starvation, the dehydration, the disease. It deserves all the attention and all the mobilization, I think, that we can muster to try to bring this horrific war to an end. And I hope the tension to this war reminds us that this isn't the only place where people suffer tremendous brutality, tremendous degradation, and tremendous violence. And so as people pay attention to what's happening in Palestine and in Israel, to keep their minds open, that this is horrific and not the only horror stories, and well documented human rights reports and violations, and now even criminal trials from Syria are some of the worst human rights violations we can imagine. And there's also a history in the Syrian conflict of a really brutal regime that carried out tremendous violence against civilians with, in the end, a kind of impunity. Bashar al-Assad got away with it. He's still there in power.
Yeah.
And as the Syrian conflict was unfolding, there was tremendous documentation about systematic, wide-scale torture in prisons, where, while we think about this use of starvation and denial of food and water as a weapon of war in Gaza, Bashar al-Assad did similar things in besieged areas in Syria. The bombardment of hospitals, which is now rightfully caused so much outrage in Gaza. Bashar al-Assad did the same thing: bombing of houses, bombing of schools, bombing of bakeries, bombing of hospitals. The Syrian war arguably contributed to a world in which states commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the rest of the world doesn't mobilize to stop them. And in Syria, as in Palestine today, these things were documented. They were documented in cell phones and videos and Twitter. They were documented in real time with Syrians crying for help. There was also UN Security Council resolutions that were vetoed. So, but we try to make sense of what has happened in Palestine and in Israel since October 7th, and how violence has gotten to such a horrific level. Understanding the Syrian war is a part of that story. In addition to the fact that millions of Syrians have suffered and continue to suffer, and also demand our empathy and our concern. And I think it's fantastic that millions have mobilized and gone out into the streets around the world to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And I also know that for many Syrians, it's quite painful that they experienced years and years of war and never saw that kind of empathy and kind of understanding and kind of mobilization. And I don't at all want to get into the business of comparing whose war is worse and whose tragedy is worse, and it's not possible, it's not useful. But I hope also people who have been so impacted, and rightfully so, by watching the tragedy that's happening in Gaza now, that this is a springboard to learning more about other conflicts and extending similar care, because human rights are human rights, and human rights violations are human rights violations. Of course, they differ in context and maybe different scale, but human suffering is human suffering, and there has been no shortage of human suffering in the Syrian context.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think I think definitely for some Syrians, it is that nobody wants to see anybody suffer, but it is, as you said, this was documented. All that we've known these things, the world knew these things, and not quite kind of the same. And again, you're absolutely right. Nobody's comparing, nothing. Nobody should do any of that, of course. But yeah, it is at the very least unfortunate that we didn't see as much mobilization and I guess you could say solidarity for. I mean, it's still ongoing, right? It's still ongoing. So yes, I agree. I think people should, continue to be, a wide lens and open to what is going on, next door, in the same, very, very close in the same region. So it's
Yes.
very, very important.
Yeah, and I would add there people can have short attention spans or limited capacity to pay attention to lots of things, and there's compassion fatigue, and there's getting used to things, which are maybe processes of the normal processes of the human condition of media overload. But what is really, I think I really want to call out are people who felt sympathy for Syria don't feel sympathy for Gaza, or vice versa. Feel sympathy for Palestinians, but did not feel sympathy for Syria. But this is where politics get in the way, where there might be people, for example, who say, oh, the Syrian plight, Assad was a criminal, but Palestinians in Gaza, for whatever reason, are somehow boggles my mind able to justify that kind of violence, because it's Hamas or whatever. Or vice versa, people who rally in solidarity with Palestine, but say, oh, the Syrian uprising, that was a Western imperialist coup and not a legitimate popular struggle.
Yeah.
So, whether or not people have limited capacity to pay attention and to mobilize, at the very least, I wouldn't want what I see as a contradiction or hypocrisy or a politics intervening to not see that both of these are human struggles that demand solidarity. If you care about human rights, you should care about the Syrian uprising and struggle against a dictatorship. And if you care about human rights, you should care about the call for Palestinian freedom and liberation from occupation, and to be free from what the ICJ tells us and is arguably genocidal violence.
So the big theme that I want to, I guess, so we talked about a few things already, but I guess the first major theme that's from the book that I want to discuss is this idea of home, and we can talk about that in a variety of ways, but I think it's a really important theme. It's something I'm interested in generally, but then when you kind of map it onto the Syrian conflict, it's got a different kind of lens on it. I think for most people that listen to this, myself included, it's unlikely that most people will go to Syria, at least right now. And it's unfortunate because it has an absolutely long, millennia-old, rich history that has, from every people I know and things I've read and all these things is absolutely gorgeous, beautiful place, and so many wonderful things about various civilizations. So obviously so many ethnic groups there, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one thing we can kind of try to understand kind of from first principles or from a kind of human context is this idea of a home. Like, for many people, this is their home, whether it's in Damascus or Aleppo, or maybe they, or other cities or other villages or towns, or maybe just they see the country as their home, right? How do you think about, I guess you do this generally, this idea of home, and what does that look like when your home isn't safe anymore? We can start with country, and then maybe city or town, and how as we'll talk about throughout the conversation, how do you don't replace your home, but sometimes you have new homes, right? And you have new places, of residing, and what that looks like. So yeah, how do you understand this concept? I guess for you personally, I mean, everyone's going to have a different concept, right? I can tell you what mine is, but generally, how do you think of this idea of home for people and what that looks like for people that are displaced?
Yeah, so it's really the premise of the book is thinking about the people I was able to talk to are people who were forced to leave their homes. Uh, their homes might no longer exist,
Yeah.
and that means their own house might have been destroyed, their neighborhood might have been destroyed, their city might be now unrecognizable. The people who used to create their world of neighbors and families and friends have all perhaps gone. And their country is no longer the same place. So they're forced to leave their home. Their home might no longer exist. They might very likely never go back. And even if they were to go back, they would find someplace completely transformed. And now many of them have found themselves living in places they never even imagined stepping foot. And they're trying to create a whole new life there, and make a new home there. So I thought about home as this universal human experience that everybody has some story of home. If I ask you, what does home mean to you? I think almost you're smiling. You can't see on the podcast, but as I ask the
You know what?
smile.
I am, because I've asked this question to different people, and I get different answers. I'll give you a sampling of some of the answers I've got from different people. Some people say, when I've asked this question, what's home? Some people will say, oh, it's the house I grew up in, right? My parents still live there. My bedroom's still upstairs on the second or third floor. Still got all my stuff in there, whatever.
Right.
Okay. Some people will say, home is where my family is, right? My family, it doesn't really matter where, the country or, the place. If I'm with my family, that's home, and it legitimately mean that. For some people, it is their country. Generally, sometimes it's regional. I can remember asking one person. I asked her. I said, "Where's home?" And they thought about it. I was like, "I don't know where home is actually," because maybe they moved around a lot, or they're whatever. And she finally said, "Home is in the country." She's like, "It could very well be the mountains or the beach, but for me, it's more geographical. If I'm in the country, that's home for me." I was like, "Oh, okay." And so many different ideas that people have of home. For myself, it's my state. So I live in the state of Maryland in the United States, and I've always lived in Maryland. So I've lived in different parts of Maryland. So it's weird. It's like anytime I travel abroad, I travel internationally or even other places in the country. As soon as I see that sign that says, welcome to Maryland, or I've landed and I'm in, Baltimore or whatever at BWI Airport, and I say, oh, okay, I'm home. I could come home to Atlanta Airport, or I could be at JFK in New York, and like, yeah, it's my country, but it's not home. New York's not home to me. Georgia's not home to me. That's not home. I could be in DC or Virginia. That's close, but it's not home. Home is the state for me. I have a big attachment here. So yeah, home really does mean different things to different people. Whether it's the physical thing, conceptually, people, space, geography. And it's very interesting to hear people's different ideas about what home means for them specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the book is all that. It's basically me asking different Syrians all over the world that exact question and finding that it means very different things to them too. But one thing that I liked about asking with this specific population is because their own experience of home has been so dramatic, so much change, and for many Syrians, Syria is a place where most people, I really identify with a hometown, where there are often these long intergenerational connections to a town. You ask people where they're from, and they know that I'm from Homs, or I'm from Damascus, or I'm from Aleppo, and that really means something. Maybe for hundreds of years, their family has gone there, and it was more the exception to the rule to move away from that town. People might be for studies or maybe for work, but more or less for most people, the expectation was they were going to continue living in their hometown and probably marry and have a family with somebody else from that hometown. So for many Syrians, they never even, the norm was to live in your town. And now suddenly, due to this extremely violent political conflict have people now spread out all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really dramatic change. And I thought of it in terms of, for some people, they might be able to take home for granted. They might not even think about home because it hasn't changed, because there's a kind of continuity.
Mm.
And I was very inspired by one geographer who I cite in the introduction to the book, who talks about being rooted. To be rooted is to be unreflexively sort of secure in a location.
Mm.
When you're at home, you don't even have to think about being at home.
Yeah.
You just are.
Mm-hmm.
But these many Syrians and displaced Syrians don't have that luxury of simply taking something for granted.
Mm.
Whatever they took for granted was shattered in a million pieces,
Mm.
which forces them to think about, so what is home really? Because my home was just ripped up from under my feet. What is home that might allow me to feel home again?
Mm.
Is it creating a new attachment to a certain place? Is it totally untethered from place? It doesn't matter from place at all. It's people, certain people, whoever you are. Is it a feeling of safety or security that if you can attain that, it doesn't matter where you are or who you're with?
Mm-hmm.
Is it some experience of being free or being respected or being dignified or feeling like you can be yourself and not have to put on an act, a kind of authenticity? And for some, it's a kind of sense of possibility. Like, home is where you can kind of achieve things, where you matter, where you matter. So, and I thought about these different types of elements: the feeling of security, of love and human connection, of the special kind of attachment to a place, like what you're talking about with Maryland, of authenticity, of comfort, of possibility. And what intrigued me also about the Syrian displacement experience was that sometimes people might feel some of those elements, but not others.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in order to get one of those elements, you have to give up others. For Syrians who maybe had to give up the connection and attachment they felt to Syria or their hometown in order to achieve security, because it was simply unsafe. Either you stay in that land you love, or you survive. So to choose to find security, they had to give up place, or in order to have place, they have to give up love because the people they love are elsewhere. Or you give up authenticity because you find yourself in a place in which you have to make a lot of compromises. Culturally, it's different. Linguistically, it's different. You can't really be yourself because you have to conform to some new social place in wherever country you never imagined being, and now you've got to be German or be Norwegian or something. But that's what you need to do in order to be next to your family. So you choose love and you give up some cultural comfort.
Yeah.
So in the process of maybe having some things, but not having everything because of this brutal and violent experience that's uprooted you, maybe people think differently about what really matters. What really matters most to them, and what they can do without because they have to do without it. And that itself is a rethinking of what home means to them. They're forced to think about it. They're forced to make really tough choices. They're forced to look within themselves and figure out who they are, what matters most. And that finding what home is also a process of self-discovery, of finding out what you need, what you don't need, what you can grow to be, who you can be. So that home, far from just, finding a house with 4 walls and a roof, is this introspective process, sometimes a painful process, but a process of growth and of wisdom. And that's what really attracted me to it, because people were, undergoing these tremendous journeys, personal, social, political. And home became a way of understanding how they made sense of themselves, how they made sense of the world, and how they found some peace in a world that was shattered. And home became a metaphor for talking about all of that.
Yeah, and I think it's also different for different people. You could have 10 folks from Syria, and they're going to see this a little bit differently based on a lot of things. One of them sometimes is age or development, right? So people that left, in 2012, at 40 years old, that's going to look very different than, the 6-year-old that left and moved to Sweden or whatever. It's going to be much different. So that's also a fascinating piece. And in terms of leaving, so we'll talk about leaving abroad a bit, but tell me about internal displacement, or sometimes some people will call it internal migration when it's more voluntary or volitional. So, okay, if you're in a really tough part of Syria or a place where there's a lot of violence, how much do we see that people are trying to move to other parts of Syria, maybe that are less violent, or maybe just across a border somewhere is very closely aligned with there, or some, or live on a border. What is the idea, I guess, about internal displacement within? I mean, Syria is a big country. It's not a small country. It's a good size. Yeah. How do we see that piece of it, and how does that look different from? Yes, I might leave my town or my village or my actual physical home. Where, yeah, maybe there's been generations, but I'm still in my country. I'm still here. It's a tough time, but it's a bit safer than maybe somewhere else. And I'm not living in, Holland or something. How do we understand that bit of it?
Yeah, so if the pre-war, pre-2011 population of Syria was about 21, 22 million or so, something like 12 million Syrians have been displaced. So over half the population
That's a lot.
is displaced. It's absolutely unfathomable.
Hmm.
And the majority of those who've been displaced, approximately 6.87 million people, are internally displaced.
Mm.
So the majority of displaced Syrians remain inside the country. So it's an enormous population. That's one thing. The other thing is that most Syrians who eventually become refugees leaving the country have been internally displaced before that. So
Mm.
many people end up moving around several times, moving from a place of that's not safe to some other place that is more safe in
Mm.
Syria before they actually leave the country. Some people might go directly from their homes to crossing an international border, but many people move around, sometimes repeatedly, before they feel like they have to leave the country.
Mm.
And the first move could be, from one part of town where there's bombardment to another part of
Mm.
town. And it could be moving in with relatives, or it could be moving to renting an apartment, or it could be living in a camp for the internally displaced, of which there are, especially
Mm.
in the Northwestern Idlib province. Um, so I think it's a different experience, because so much of being an external refugee is adjusting to the new circumstances of a foreign country. It
Mhm.
could be learning a new language.
Mhm.
Um, it's also, for many people, the question of legal residence
Yeah.
becomes huge. As soon as you leave the question, there's a question: all right, can you legally stay?
Right.
And in the countries on Syria's borders, where the large majority of refugees live, in Turkey and in Lebanon and Jordan, most people have a kind of temporary protected status. They might be without papers, or they have a kind of temporary protected status. They're sort of guests.
Yeah.
They don't have any permanent, except for a very small number, a permanent residence. So they don't know if they'll stay, if they'll go, if they'll be deported, if the political winds will change and somebody will start to crack down, and people will demand them going, or a political leader decides to deport people. So
Mm.
that presumably you don't have when you're still in your own country, to deal with your legal residence.
Mm.
Um, as well as these questions of finding work, and people often working in the informal labor market, because if they don't have papers to work legally, then they're working in the informal market, which are often jobs that are very low pay, high risk, no recourse if you have a bad boss who decides not to pay you, exploitative conditions, um, and this uncertainty of also knowing, should you return, should you not return, will you return, the way that it puts life in a kind of limbo when you're not sure where you're going next, until you perhaps eventually get somewhere, or make some reach a point where you see that you have a more permanent reality in that country of refuge. um, so those are some hardships that come with being an external refugee, as opposed to someone who's internally displaced. But someone who's internally displaced in Syria is still dealing with all the hardships
Yeah.
that other people who've left have left
Mm-hmm.
for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you live in the Syrian context, if you're living in regime-controlled areas, that means you're still living under the brutality of abusive security forces that arrest people at will and checkpoints where they can stop you and send you to prison, or of dealing with corruption, of dealing what is now in Syria a horrific economic collapse. It's not enough fuel, not enough food, not enough work, not enough electricity. Um, uh, so they're coping with the huge hardships that refugees were often lucky enough to have left behind. That's in regime areas, and in rebel controlled areas, they are still, often facing bombardment from regime airplanes, where there's still an ongoing struggle. The military battles have muted. They are lesser than they were at the height of the war, but there is still there there's still conflict, and there's still people who are militarily, killed or at
Mm-hmm.
risk.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just so much suffering, so much vulnerability, um, and so much hardship. But the hardship is very different depending on where you wind up, whether you're still in the country or whether you are in the Middle East and the country's there, or whether you wound up in Europe or North America or somewhere else. There's lots of trouble and lots of struggle and lots of challenge, but the challenges are different.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's, I think to the, whenever people, there's different reasons people will do this, but to make the decision to leave the country,
Mm.
you know, again, that's not easy to do for a variety of reasons. It's not for, obviously, as you say, the legality of it, papers wise, things like that. But also, what are you going to do, right? Like, what kind of, employment are you going to have? Where are you going to be educated? Every country is a little bit different, and there are some countries that are neighboring countries to Syria that might be, um, you know, there might be some similarities, maybe in terms of food or language or religion or things like that, but it's not the same. Even
Yes.
even when you're looking at something like Turkey, there's a lot of I think most Syrians are in Turkey, and Turkey has been
Yes.
pretty hospitable, more or less, to Syrians. But Turkey's it's got its own history. There's a different language. They speak Turkish. I mean, they speak Arabic there too, but it's
Mhm.
very different. It's a different setup. And that's different from Iraq on the other side,
Mhm.
Jordan on the other side. These countries are all a little bit different, and then you start expanding outward, and then it just starts to become more
Yes.
different in terms of language and religion and people groups and things like that. So yeah, that decision to finally leave, let's say your hometown and then country, has to be very, very, very difficult. Um, I guess again, this is a more abstract question, and the thing that's really nice about the book is that it kind of, all of this, the accounts give the humanness to some of these abstract ideas. But
Mhm. Mhm.
what is it that you think people are leaving, right? Like, people are leaving, yes, their home, they're leaving conflict, but kind of those themes you were talking about, they're leaving something and trying to look for something else, which is safety, security, identity, belonging, many, many other things. So yeah, what is it, maybe abstractly, that many Syrians are leaving, and then what are they hoping to get, or what are they going towards? And sometimes that does or doesn't work out. Let's talk about that kind of parallel.
Yeah. So I can say, for all the stories in this book, everyone left basically because they felt like they had to.
Yeah.
No, they all left. Most of these people were fleeing their lives, whether it was an immediate leave now or you're going to be killed, or leave now because you're going to get killed sooner or later and you might as well try to get out now. So there are, for example, a couple people whose stories are in the book were people who were imprisoned, and they were lucky enough to get out of prison. But there was indication that if they didn't leave the country again, they would probably be arrested a second time. and there was no way they were going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
There were other people who were fleeing bombing. There was people who were fleeing military service because there was universal conscription. All young men have to serve the army. For many who were ideologically opposed, serving in the army means serving a government and a system that they oppose, and having to shoot the members of the opposition they identified with. Um, they didn't want to be a part of this war. So there are some people who defected from the army. There are other people who someone in the family defected, and the whole family felt like they had to get out, or they were going to be persecuted for that defection, or they left out before they could be recruited. And there are people who were participating in protests and left out before they got. So basically, everybody was fleeing for their lives in some way. They did not. If they stayed in Syria, they would not be safe.
Let me jump in here real quick on something. So this was what was interesting about reading this. So totally different for a variety of reasons in terms of timing and geography and everything, but there is some similarities here. I've talked about this before in various episodes, but so my dad is from El Salvador, and he came to the United States in 1980 because they were having a horrific civil war, really, really terrible. And there's, he has a lot of horrible, memories. He's got some good memories too, but some horrible memories. And I've asked him this at different points. I was like, when did you know? Like, when did you know to leave? He came when he was not very small. He came when he was an adolescent, but he was, I said, when did you know? Like, it's not, because it had been going on for about 2 years before he left. And it was pretty brutal in the first 2 years. He says, well, he's like, you don't want to die. He was like, I kind of got used to seeing dead bodies and people being hung and body parts and going to school. Like, it was pretty terrible. But and going to sleep with, people, shooting and bombing, all these things. He said, but I think it's when, I got that note in school, you got to join a side because you're of age, or you and your family are going to die. And that's just how it is. And so, his mom was like, you got to get the hell out of here. And and then it was very kind of like one day, 1 week to the next, it was, well, I'm leaving. And, as is true for many people in this region, especially at that time, you're not really going to go to neighboring countries because they also had either conflict at similar times, or it was very difficult for one person to the next. Again, that's a different geography and timing and stuff. But, on top of, pretty extreme poverty, which was also a really big issue in and of itself and still is. And the risk to, come very, very far to the U.S., made sense, because it was like, hey, everywhere else in between isn't really great for me, and I don't want to die. So, So it's interesting hearing that. I think the general point of what you're saying here is right, is if people are going to leave, it's usually a really good reason. It's not, I'm kind of feel uncomfortable here, or, maybe it will get better. No, it's literally staring you in the face typically. And there's already been probably weeks or months or even years of, okay, maybe this, we can get by, maybe this. But once you're kind of hit in the face, or it's close enough to you, there's usually a good reason for people to leave. It's not, and again, it's not, it's not, well, we just want a better life or something like that, in the abstract. It's more of like, this is a very acute, in your face kind of problem. And so reading some of those stories and reading some of that, again, totally different times, totally different, countries, and all these things. But the idea of leaving a country because of civil war, and because there's something staring you in the face, is like, oh yeah, that's kind of applies. I mean, this applies in various African countries as well, where you hear these stories as well. So it's usually pretty stark. The kind of like, okay, we have to leave, or we're not going to make it. So I think that's very much underlined here.
Yeah, no, thanks. Absolutely. And what also comes to light in some of the stories in the book is people who really, really, really didn't want to leave. Even when they knew it was so dangerous, some of the people are begging their families, please, 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 let us not go. I want to stay. I want to stay. And sometimes you have parents fighting with their children who are saying, enough. It is unsafe. We are going to die. You cannot stay. And it's so kids saying, no, please, please, can we stay?
Yeah.
So even even in a situation of war, when people realize it's so unsafe, many of them, it's tremendously painful to go. I mean, many, painful and conflicted and wanting to stay and then missing it terribly. And then another theme that comes out sort of later in the book then is also the guilt of having left and who you left behind, and the guilt of you got out and survived and who stayed and did not survive. And that's something that many people live with, a kind of survivor's guilt. So it was really life and death. Nobody left lightly. Some people had to be dragged out, but ultimately they left because if they did not, they very well would have been killed one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's obviously this great loss, again, not just of home or a place, but it's also kind of, material things, physical things, whatever it may be, sense of community, sometimes family members, definitely many things. But eventually people get to, sometimes, as you said, there's multiple movements, right? So they might move somewhere else in the country. But when they go out, sometimes people end up in what do they call them? I think there's different names, refugee camps or displacement camps. I know they're called different things, and there's a bunch there on southeast border of Turkey. I think Gaziantep is one major city down there that has a lot of Syrian folks, and other places. So sometimes it might be that. Sometimes, and this is what's so nice about the book, is you talk about the differences here. Some people, they just kind of are able to kind of slip through, and they're able to get through, and they make it happen, and it works, or they have good fortune or luck on their side. So when you're trying to, it's two things, right? You have this sense of loss, you have this survival thing, but okay, I'm going to lose something. Then they have to, if they, whatever country they land in or place they land in, they have to then build. So how do I build a new home here? How do I integrate here? How do I identify here? How do, and it might be different if you're going to Germany or France or even Turkey, and those are nearby places, not to say anything of Canada or the United States. It's very different. So yeah, how do you think, the question, and this isn't unique to Syrians, but I think in general, but there might be some different shades here of maintaining your own culture and your sense of home from Syria, but also, integrating, acculturating, whatever word you want to use, to the new place where you're moving to. How do they build a new home in other places?
Yeah, I think people build it because they have to. People need to survive and find meaning and find belonging and find a sense of peace and uh, make better lives for themselves, and it requires an adaptation. So I think it very much differs depending on lots of things. But as you said before, people's age and their generation, where they are in life. So, for example, I talk to many people in maybe their 20s, and maybe they interrupted their college educations, or maybe they finished, or maybe they were young professionals, but they were at a point in life where they could imagine maybe learning an entirely new language, maybe going back to school, because professionally, there's often a problem about whether people can continue working in their own field. Maybe they have degrees as a doctor or as an engineer or as a pharmacist or as an architect, and they get somewhere, let's say somewhere in Europe, that doesn't recognize those degrees, and they have to go back to school and start all over, or do a lot of retraining, or maybe rethink themselves professionally. So it's not only that people lost their hometown, lost Syria and their communities and their places, they also may have lost to some degree who they thought they were and could be in those places, because they're now in places that have totally different circumstances. So to start work again, you have to, learn a completely new language and a completely new function, totally new system. You might have to do significant re-education or retraining, or maybe just start over in a completely new field, because maybe it's just impossible to work in your field again. So, for example, I talked to Syrian lawyers or law students in Germany. They have a degree in Syrian law, to practice law in Syria. They're experts in the law in Syria. Doesn't do you any good when you arrive in Germany. So maybe you can start all over learning the German legal system. So some careers might transfer better than others. But there's so much work that people feel like they probably take 80 steps backwards in order to start taking steps forward again. I think it must be such a challenge of patience and strength and spirit to keep up and not be discouraged. And this is just the challenge of building life again. And as you alluded to, there's this double challenge. At the same time, people are making sense of the fact that countries have just been destroyed and their families have just been scattered. And they themselves might have experienced horrific traumatic violence. So there's making sense of all that is related to the loss of one home while undertaking this almost heroic new trajectory of starting life basically from scratch or from below scratch. There's a Syrian expression of below zero. People are starting below, not just from zero, they're starting below zero. So it takes so much work. And those are also, that's in the places where I'm referring to Europe, where at the very least there might be state services, a social welfare state that gives people maybe housing when they arrive, that can maybe pay for integration classes where people can learn the language, maybe pay for a monthly stipend. And then in other places, like in Turkey, Lebanon, and in Syria, or in Jordan, they might not have any state services at all. So in Lebanon, for example, people might, how they even scrap together money for any kind of shelter and food and electricity because the state's not given anything.
Yeah.
So even where in a place where a state provides some circumstance, some services and legal protections and possibility for asylum, it's extremely hard. But in places where countries where there is already economic crisis, like in Lebanon, for example, or already huge unemployment, like in Jordan, and the state is in no position to be able to actually provide aid to refugees. And what any aid international organizations provide is far, far, far too little. And that's in part because wealthy countries, the global north, aren't paying their fair share to provide services, to provide donations to what the international organizations need in order to sustain basic things. People are really barely getting by. So it's from the most material challenge of making it by economically to the personal challenge of rethinking who you are, to the cultural challenge of maybe of getting used to a totally different way of life. Plus all the challenges of being in a society where maybe you're looked upon with racism, with Islamophobia, with hatred of who you are, refugees and migrants coming to take our jobs, or you're Arabs and Muslims, so you're backwards and uncivilized. Oh, you're brown skin, so you're probably a thief, right? I mean, so people are also encountering all the kinds of everyday and systemic racism that we can imagine. So the challenges are just immense. Like it's so inspiring to hear these stories and think, wow, despite all of these challenges in every way, where people came from and what they're dealing with now, that people find within themselves the strength to keep going, is just so humbling. So humbling.
Yeah. I mean, and every person I've met that's from Syria is, they have such good resilience is an understatement. So even folks that have been, maybe not born in Syria, maybe they're first generation of wherever from their parents, there's still a kind of spirit there that, they definitely don't forget that. They definitely, have a good fight in them, which is great. So the final question I have for you is, what do you think the future holds for, not just Syria? I mean, hopefully the war will end sooner than later. It's been too long already, but I guess this new Syrian diaspora. What do you think the future holds for these folks that are finding their ways in new countries, environments, communities? What's the kind of the outlook you have for these folks?
Oh, I don't know if I can allow myself to be optimistic during such dark times, but maybe I'll seize the chance.
Sure.
I think the sky is the limit for these people and their children and their children's children. And what I have seen in my own 12 years of watching this population, for me, is extraordinary. People who I met in Jordan or Lebanon and Turkey and still thought they'd go back to Syria and weren't sure where they were going. Um, were left temporarily and expected to go home any day now. Some of those people are now in Europe, speak a completely new language, have children who, now speak Dutch or French or German fluently. So the possibilities for moving forward when people are given a chance, when they're just given the most basic of legal rights, some aid to get them going, some opportunities for study, to be able to invest in themselves and build professional lives. People's capacity for work, sacrifice, and set goals and to achieve them is absolutely immense. They can achieve and already have achieved so much if they're given the most basic, meet with the most basic circumstances that would allow someone to succeed. So I've seen people do enormous things. I met a doctor in Jordan who was, kind of working semi-illegally because they weren't allowing Syrian doctors to work. So he would work, but it was a Jordanian doctor that had to sign the forms and things. He is now retrained and working in Frankfurt, Germany, as a completely functional, German citizen and doctor conducting his entire medical life in Germany. I've seen it. It's and that's like those are like the star success stories, but I see people who reinvented their lives and decided that they wanted to be poets or writers or whatever. I'm very optimistic of what this new diasporic population can achieve, and this is just the generation that migrated.
Yeah.
The sky is a limit for their kids, because even people that have achieved so much themselves migrating will be the first to say, I'm doing this for my children. Forget me. I'm doing everything I'm doing is so my kids can have a better life than I can have. So I think that there is, in a generation or two, we're going to have generations of Syrian Germans, Syrian Swedes, Syrian Canadians, Syrian Americans, Syrian Turks, that if given the most basic of circumstances, can do amazing things for themselves, for their communities. And then my hope is that they also will be able to do things for Syria itself. And that, as hard as it is to make change now inside and under the rule of this authoritarian regime, that with time, this diaspora and its capacity and its will to contribute to a free Syria can be some source of pressure, some source of change. It might take a long time. It might not be direct. But I hope that this diaspora can not only do amazing things for every country in which they settled, amazing things for themselves and their families, but also be a force for a better Syria. This might be a pipe dream, but thank you for giving me the invitation to dream a little bit, and hopefully someday we'll see it all come true.
Yeah. I think it's important. I think it's important for them to keep fighting for what they want for their own people in their own country, and to have folks like yourself to keep supporting them, keep sharing their stories and their voices. So I think that's really, really important. Wendy, this was so much fun. I greatly appreciate you coming on and giving me all of your wisdom and all of your thoughts and all your passion. It's really wonderful, and I greatly enjoyed all the themes and the discussion we had here today about an important topic.
Thank you so much for having me on. And as I said, this is my first interview about a book that's still yet to be published. So I can't wait to hear more people as they read it, react to it, and sort of engage with them.
Yeah.
Reflect on it.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Big thank you.